Yeah, how's it going, everybody? This is School02 here. I just wanted to go through and kind of explain Madolche a little bit. I see a lot of people kind of come in to either the Discord or a lot of other places, not necessarily know what cards they need, how the deck runs, because it is a weird deck. My favorite thing about it, like, the question people might ask is, why Madolche? What does Madolche do? Well, Madolche is essentially, I treat it as a mid-range deck that basically does a little bit of everything. It plays a little bit more like a control deck. It's very defensive, but it also is as explosive as a hyper combo deck when it needs to be. It has probably unparalleled board breaking capabilities, thanks to one of the strongest boss monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh history, despite the fact that she's from 2014. Something else that's really nice is that for the most part, Madolche is a very cheap for as close to meta as it is. And it's also relatively safe in the ban list. So you see like all these cards in the side list. Halki Fibrax, Link Cross, Jet Synchron, Eldritch the Golden Lord, Borreload Savage. You just kind of keep going. True King of all Calamities, Isolde. These cards are not only expensive, but they're kind of a pain in the butt. And I've never seen a Madolche build use almost any of these. I think the only Madolche builds I've seen Eldritch used in one. I've seen one Eldritch Madolche, and like you can theoretically make Dragoon of Red Eyes, but you have to sacrifice your entire Madolche board for it. So like that's possible, but it's not necessarily good. The one thing that's nice about that is you can do Dragoon with Secret Village of the Spellcasters, but even that is like it's a lot of eggs in the Dragoon basket, and the deck doesn't really need that to function. So, without further ado, let's go into the Madolche core, and we're going to go over kind of card by card what they are, what the ratios are, and why the ratios are the way they are. So first up, you have Madolche Magdalene. She's kind of the poster child for the archetype. The first effect, every Madolche monster shares this from the main deck. It is if this monster is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, it gets shuffled into the deck. This is mandatory, and it is an activated effect. It's the archetypal gimmick. It's not bad. It means you can recycle your resources, but it also is kind of troublesome sometimes because getting monsters into the graveyard is a lot harder than it sounds sometimes, which can be a problem. So Magdalene, when she's normal summoned, she's a Rhoda. She can search any Madolche monster from your deck to your hand. Pretty much at all times, you're going to want to run 3. Madolche Pating Sassur is normally what you're searching with Magdalene. She has the normal Madolche effect, and if you have no monsters in your graveyard, she can be special summoned, and then if she is special summoned, she can summon a Madolche monster from the deck. Its level's reduced by 1, and then you're Madolche locked for the rest of the turn. If this effect resolves, and you continue unimpeded from there, she is a +7 with 4 of your opponent's cards shuffled away, with 8k damage on board, and I'm not joking. She is one of the most ridiculous single cards. If you can negate her, you absolutely should negate her. Angeli, she has the normal Dolce effect, but she's also a Lone Fire Blossom. She tributes herself to summon one from deck. The nice thing about that effect is the monster that's summoned can't be destroyed by battle, and it's shuffled into the deck during the end phase of your next turn. So it's going to be on field to be indestructible from battle, which is great because there's other ways to protect the monster as well to make it essentially indestructible, whatever is summoned off of Angeli. Up next, we have 2 Hoot Cake. Hoot Cake is your final starter. So these 9 cards up here, these are all your normal starters. Hoot Cake is a conditional starter. So Hoot Cake targets a monster in the graveyard, banishes it, and then summons a Madolche monster from the deck. So you run at least 2 because he's an engine requirement, and a lot of time you do need to summon from deck with something like an Angeli. But he's also a conditional starter. So if you have to use a hand trap or you need to recover later on, Hoot Cake is what you want to draw because Magdalene and Pating do not necessarily start your combo later on in the game. It's only with an empty graveyard that these 2 are full combo. Next up, you have 2 Madolche Mesgelato. You have to run 2 because if you draw 1, he's essentially a Garnet, but he's also an engine requirement, so drawing him basically means you just don't get to play. So you run 2, you hope you don't draw both, it's pretty rare. If you draw one, you can usually find a way to get him on board and get him back in the deck, which is good too. And then the last monster is a one of Madolche Pudding Cess. I didn't go over Messenger Gelato's effect. Messenger Gelato, if you have a beast type Madolche, so normally just Hoot Cake, you can add a Madolche spell or trap to your hand, and this effect is not once per turn. So every time you special him out with the Hoot Cake on board, you can search a new spell or trap. So very, very strong effect, just also very obnoxious because he has to be specialed. You can't normal summon him to get the search. Lastly is Madolche Pudding Cess. I used to think this card would be better as a vanilla, but as it turns out, she is really, really, really important in the deck to run at least one. So the main effect that you want to notice here, she gets an attack boost, so there's no monsters in the graveyard. That doesn't matter. She's level 5, her stats are not good even with the attack boost. But the main thing is that after damage calculation, when she battles, you can target one card your opponent controls and destroy it. Madolche have a searchable in-archetype out to a lot of degenerate things like Buster Dragon, getting rid of like any specific problematic card. Pudding Cess can out any of that problematic back row. It's very, very important that you don't forget that she has that effect. But she's also just very important as she has to be on field for a lot of secondary effects in the archetype to activate. Lastly, the spell and traps. Normally, like the bare minimum ratio is you run one Chateau, which is the field spell, gives a little bit of an attack boost to all your monsters, and also if a monster in the graveyard is returned to the deck by the effect by a Madolche monster, you can add to your hand instead. Something to note is that this is all monsters. This is not exclusive to Madolche monsters. So if you have, say, an Ash Blossom and a Madolche monster shuffles it into the deck, you can add it to your hand instead. So you can actually recycle your hand traps in this deck, which is a really, really powerful interaction that shouldn't be underestimated whatsoever. Next up, you have Madolche Salon. This is one of the newest pieces of support. Once per turn, it's a archetypal double summon, so you can summon an extra Madolche monster in addition to your normal summoner set. And it's important that this is a normal summon because it means that Magdalene actually can activate. So you can actually get 2 Magdalene searches in the same turn with Salon, which is really crazy. And the second effect is that if a Madolche card is shuffled into the deck, then you get to set a Madolche spell or trap from your deck, which is really important to search out, normally the Omni Negate. Secondly, you have Madolche Ticket. Biggest thing that this does is it's the same effect as Salon for the secondary effect, where a monster gets shuffled into the deck, except you search a Madolche monster, and then if you have a fairy, which is normally will be what's going on, you'll be able to special summon it instead of adding it to your hand. So basically, you kind of get the plus off of the destruction of your monsters or the shuffle back. Anything that your opponent tries to do in general is going to end up plussing you if Salon and Ticket are on the field. Lastly, we have Madolche Promenade. This card is essentially the Omni Negate for the archetype. You target one card your opponent controls and one Madolche monster you control, or importantly in your graveyard, and it negates the face-up card, and then adds the Madolche card back to your hand, which is great because its card effect triggers your Salon, triggers your Ticket, and it triggers your Pudding Cess later on. So basically, this is the bare minimum core you want to run, these 19 cards. At no point should you ever run anything less than these ratios for these cards for the most part. You pretty much need at least one of everything. Chateau is real. You might think like maybe I could take Chateau out. Chateau is actually an extender in your combos. Salon and Ticket are both extenders in combos and very important to actually get your full combo, full damage, lethal combo in. Promenade gives you... This was the card that I think actually pushed the deck over the top and made it... previously, Madolche was known as a blind second deck, and Promenade's release pushed it to be a going first strategy where it actually is okay going first now. So, just if you want to go into archetypal stuff that's a little bit spicier, we're going to ignore the 2 Gemini Elves, those are just placeholders. But third Hoot Cake is not uncommon in very hand trap heavy builds. I personally run a third Hoot Cake right now because I think you have to run hand traps. But it is format dependent. If hand traps are less common, or you can run specific types of hand traps, then you can get away with just 2 Hoot Cake. And in general, it's better because it's a consistency increase. Since one of the weird things about the archetype is there's a bit of a nombo between Magdalene, Pudding Cess, and Hoot Cake in that these two require there to be no monsters on the field to have full combo, and Hoot Cake requires there to be, or no monsters in the graveyard to have full combo, and Hoot Cake has to have a monster in the graveyard for its combo. Some decks will run a second Pudding Cess. This is especially common if you run Madolche Knights. Madolche Croissant is kind of a weird tech. I've never actually played with it, but I know he's not uncommon. He bounces a card from a Madolche monster to your hand, and if that happens, then you get to turn it into level 4, but also because you're bouncing, you get to activate your extra Salon or your ticket and get some more searches going. So it can be very powerful, also can be a bit of a brick. Butler-esque is funny because this card was thought of as a meme for a very long time, given that Gelato is better at searching out the Madolche field spell. However, the thing that Butler-esque does that Mess and Gelato does not do is Butler-esque can search any field spell, which means that you can kind of look for the strongest field spells that you can access, and you can run those in the deck. We'll go over 2 of the more common picks later under the extra editions section. You'll see a lot of builds run 2 field spells. That generally just kind of helps extend further, since again the field spell can act as an extra extender. 2 Madolche Salon. You can run 3 Salon, especially going second builds, because Salon plus 2 Madolches in hand can help you play through hand traps. Madolche Knights is a common extra counter trap. It negates a monster effect specifically if you have no monsters in the graveyard, which Madolche can actually pull off despite through their full combo. And it also has a hand rip effect if you control Madolche Pudding Cess, which is also possible. So pretty fun tech. It's not necessarily strong at all times, but it's really satisfying to pull off. And lastly, you can run a second Promenade, which is great because it lets you kind of recycle the Omni-Negate effect. And also, since Promenade has a graveyard effect where you can attach a Madolche monster to an extra deck Xyz monster for free from basically anywhere, running a second one means that if you have to use the floating effect, then you're actually able to still continue with negation on your opponent's turn if you don't manage to kill. Don't think it's strictly necessary, but it's not ever really bad to have a second Promenade. So, we're going to go over the extra deck staples real quick. This is extravagance board ratios. So, we'll start off first with Glass Souffle. Glass Souffle is the defensive Madolche Xyz. On a quick effect, she can target one Madolche monster on the field, and it's unaffected by monster effects except its own. The most common target for this will be a Hoot Cake that is summoned off of an Angeli, so it'll be undestructible by battle, and it will not be able to be destroyed by or affected by monster effects. It makes it very difficult to out a Hoot Cake that's on your field. And the second effect has a bit of a weird trigger that actually can kind of be a problem sometimes. But if a Madolche card is sent to your graveyard while it's on the field, you can shuffle 2 cards in the graveyard into the deck, which is non-targeting, first of all, which is great. And second of all, it's allows you to plus if you shuffle in one of your own Madolche cards, while also clearing out your graveyard, which can be important in order to activate Petting Sister's effect. Then you have the offensive rank 4, which is Tiramisu. This is a card that was not power corrupt at all until Dingirsu came out. Her effect, you can detach 1 Xyz material to target 2 Madolche cards in your graveyard, shuffle those cards into the deck. Also after that, shuffle cards your opponent controls into the deck up to the number of cards you returned. So a couple of very important things for this. Number 1, this is non-targeting, non-destructive removal of your opponent's field. It is not once per turn, and it says returned, not returned to the deck. So you can add the cards to your hand with the field spell and still get the shuffle back on your opponent's cards. Or you can shuffle back an extra deck monster and still get the reward. She's absolutely busted. Running out of these makes it very hard to clear boards, but if you have at least one in your extra deck, you're pretty much able to go off at all times. Lastly, 3 chocolate a la mode. Again, this is extravagance ratios. If you're running a non-extravagance board, you can run just 2 tiramisu and 2 chocolate a la mode. Tends to get the job done, but also running 3 doesn't really hurt anything either. The reason you run 3 glace souffle is because going first, glace souffle is what you make, and also glace souffle is a much You have to banish her in your standard combo, and you don't ever lose a Tiramisu in your standard combo, so it makes a difference. The last one is a rank 5, but you're never going to summon her using 2 rank 5 Earths. In general, the way to get Chocolate All Mode out is you can just rank up Tiramisu or Glass Souffle into her. And she has 2 effects. First one, she targets a Madolche in the graveyard, shuffles it into the deck. And if she sees a card get shuffled into the deck, or a Madolche card gets shuffled into the deck, then she gets to detach a material and summon a monster from the deck if she has Pudding Cess as material. So you kind of do what you can to get Pudding Cess as material on Chocolate All Mode, and you plus to infinity. Lastly, there is an archetypal Link monster that is Madolche Fresh to start. She's okay. It's funny, she came out in the same set as Halki Fibrax and is nowhere near as strong. But she does do very good things for the archetype. So if she points to a Madolche monster, Madolche spells and traps you control can't be destroyed by card effects. They also can't be targeted, so it's good protection for your back row, which is important considering that your back row is what's going to plus you when your opponent's trying to beat over you. And then her second effect is she has a protection effect for herself, where if she would ever be destroyed, you can shuffle Madolche monster from your graveyard into the deck instead. It's a surprisingly versatile effect. You can crash her into monsters. You can't really negate the effects unless you negate everything about her, but like people will forget that she has the protection effect. They'll crash into Sistart, and then you'll just summon new monsters out from your deck because you're plussing with your ticket and your salon. She's a fairy as well, so again, ticket can summon from the deck. She's not necessary, but she's not bad to have. And she's significantly less important now that Master Rule 5. Back in Master Rule 4, you did have to actually have one because you couldn't do the combo without her. So, a couple other extra deck cards. I always say that you should run at least one card in your extra deck that outs back row. Tornado Dragon is better, but Nightmare Phoenix also lets you clear out a token if you're given one by the effect of Lost World. Both have their merits. I usually will run Tornado Dragon first and then run a Phoenix second, but you can also do it the other way around. Gaga Cowboy doesn't come up that often, but if you get into a time scenario, you can make a rank 4 relatively easily and just burn for game. And then Baguska, if Pating Cessor gets hit by an Ash Blossom, you can make this. And a lot of decks just can't play through it and get more monsters on the field. So, as far as non-archetypal staples go, there's a couple cards that I think you should pretty much always main deck. Firstly, 3 Called by the Grave. This is not optional. The one thing about Madolche is because kind of their big extension was kind of patched into the playstyle, they are a bit linear at times and therefore very fragile. Called by the Grave allows you to protect the somewhat linear combos from Effect Veiler, Ghost Ogre, or Ash Blossom. Unfortunately, it does not work against Nibiru, but still does help. Red Reboot, I think, should pretty much always be main decked. It's at 1 right now for good reason. If this card ever resolves in Madolche, I usually feel like I've won the game right there. Basically, it's just the best back row hate in the game. And one thing about Madolche is it's very good at breaking boards when it knows where the points of interaction are. But if it's handling unknowns like hand traps or back row trap cards, quick play spells, it can actually struggle quite a bit. So Red Reboot patches up a pretty big weakness in the deck. 3 Imperm. Impermanence is like the hand trap of choice from the deck that you're pretty much always going to run. Unfortunately, it's still a bit expensive, but what it does can't really be replaced. It's monster negation on a card that is not a monster in the graveyard. Meaning that you can use this and then still use Pating Cessor if you're forced to go second. And then lastly, Pot of Extravagance. The deck struggles for draw power and can be a bit bricky at times. Getting these 2 extra cards, even at the risk of losing some of your extra deck monsters, is well worth the risk. So, up next, we've got common hand traps. So you got your normal stuff like your Ash Blossom. You can still run Ash Blossom, Ghost Ogre, Veiler, DD Crow. I did want to kind of go over some other ones that you'll see a lot more commonly. So first things first, The deck can run Dimension Shifter. It's scary. It's difficult. A lot of people don't agree with it. It's kind of a controversial talking point in the Madolche community as of right now. I will go over why I think Madolche or Dimension Shifter is actually very strong in Madolche later. Nibiru is great in the deck because it stays on field after you activate it, so you activate Nibiru, wipe their whole board, and then hopefully can go off from there. Phantasme as well. Phantasme sticks on the board whenever you use it. The downside of Phantasme and Nibiru are that they do turn off impermanence because you will have a monster on your side of the field. Gamma is another monster hand trap that ends up banishing himself rather than going to the graveyard. You do have to run the Psyframe driver as a brick, but usually it's worth it. As I mentioned, Ash Blossom is pretty generic. The downside to Ash Blossom is that it does turn off the Pating Cesseur as a starter, meaning that you go from your 9 starters that you have normally available at the beginning of the game to 5 with the 3 Angelies and the Hoot Cake. In general, in decks that are running Ash Blossom and other hand traps, that's when you want to run your 3rd Hoot Cake, so that you get to at least 6 starters if you have to play one of your hand traps. You will see some decks run Herald of the Orange Light. Pating Cesseur, Angeli, and Pudding Cess are all fairies, so you can discard one of them with this to negate a monster effect, much like you could with Psyframe Gear Gamma. It is a very heavy hand commitment and can be pretty scary thanks to the downside of Hoot Cake and turning off your additional starters. Something you would see sometimes during when Orcus was big, might come back at some point, was Chaos Hunter. You can see your opponent special summon a monster, you discard a card, and this sticks on the field. Gives you a nice little beat stick, and also prevents your opponent from banishing cards, which can be enough to shut some decks down. As far as 2 cards that aren't necessarily hand traps, but just important deck breakers, Forbidden Droplets and Dark Ruler No More are very good in the deck. Droplet less so, but this is kind of better for the current format, even though Dark Ruler No More is better in the deck, if that makes sense. And then Kaijus actually have always kind of gone hand in hand with Madolche because getting rid of any sort of effect negation is a big deal, given that you need only a couple effects to resolve, and then from there the combo kind of plays itself and you can wipe pretty much anything your opponent wants to do. So lastly, these are kind of the fun techs you can run. Different hybrid decks or things that end up working pretty well. First of all, when I mentioned Butler-esque searching field spells, the 2 most common variants you'll see that you can get off of that field spell search are Generator Boss Stage and the Hidden City. More commonly, that'll be done with Generator Boss Stage just because it's one of the strongest field spells in the game. You can summon a big, giant, essentially negation plus Dark Law hand rip. Very, very powerful going first. The downside is that it does involve a lot of summons, gives you a massive board, and can be a bit bricky because Butler-esque doesn't do much on his own. You have to search both him and Salon to make the play work. There are some Dogmatica Madolche builds out there. Jabrail thinks this, who is, in my opinion, one of the top, 3 or so Madolche pilots in the TCG, thinks this is the current best version of the deck. It is very odd, so I don't know if I necessarily agree, but it is something you can do. Revelry of Warlords is the floodgate of choice, or not Revelry of Warlords, excuse me, that's the wrong one. Goes in match is the floodgate of choice. Artifact Scythe is great going first. Again, you're looking for generic power cards that prevent your opponent from playing enough to where you can OTK on the snapback, which the deck does very easily. Super Poly, another very strong tech, has both offensive and defensive properties. And then lastly, there are Subterror Madolche hybrid decks, because even though you're Madolche locked, thanks to Pating Cesseur, you can still set a Guru, flip it with Hidden City, search a Fiendus, and then you have kind of an extra protection and negation. And again, Hidden City is technically searchable off of Butler-esque, although that is a little bit trickier to make work at times, but it does work. So yeah, that is the intro to Madolche. That's the general deck build and outlook. These are not the only techs, these aren't the only cards you can run. Just kind of the 60 that came to mind immediately. I guess 57. The Gemini Elves don't necessarily count. But yeah, it's a pretty fun. It's a different deck. It's relatively cheap for the power level, which I think is a big bonus. I think the only really expensive cards now are your Hootcakes and your Messengelados. Everything else is a couple bucks at most. So, would definitely recommend picking up, if you're interested in them, picking up a lot of the cards in the core right now, because over time, cards like Salon, cards like Angeli are all going to go up over time. So, I will create a second video that details the combo routes and how to kind of do the two basic combos. And then I'll show a third combo using Dimension Shifter, because a lot of people don't realize that that is playable in the deck, and I kind of wanted to kind of get a video out there for how Dimension Shifter can be used effectively in the deck. So keep an eye out for that, and thanks for watching, everybody.